Okay, I want to welcome everybody back. This is the second presentation from Tuesday's class. This presentation is going to be an IEP for my child. There are two handouts that you're going to need. The first is obviously the PowerPoint, just so you can follow along with the slides. The second is the writing guide for the IEP. And the writing guide is just an annotated sample IEP. And the benefit of it is that as we're going through our presentation, you can take a look at the writing guide and just see in a little bit more detail what section or sections we're talking about. So we are going to get started. We've already talked about that. We've talked about that. So what are we going to cover? So we're going to be talking about the IEP and the general curriculum. We're going to be talking about how to fill out each section of the IEP. We're going to be talking a little bit about accountability for progress and progress reporting. But really what this workshop is all about is how do we complete that IEP? What are the various sections? How do they relate to one another? And then we will also talk about writing goals. So this is just a reminder, a little bit of a refresher. Here's that special education process that we talked about earlier. This piece looks a little bit different than in basic rights, but this is the process. Remember, keep it in mind where we are. Where are we right now? We are in the IEP meeting and development and also the IEP placement. This is where we are, okay? And, you know, who creates the IEP team? Well, who creates the IEP, excuse me. It's the IEP team, and let's go to this slide real quickly as a refresher. And remember, the student is the center. We've talked about all of these various members. Let's go back to the slide. What's really important is that IEP meetings can now be held by teleconference, video conference, or virtual meetings. So if somebody physically can't be present, perhaps that person can actually dial in, they can Skype, or that's the benefit of technology these days. But it's really important that an IEP cannot be developed without the parent present, okay? And in addition, beginning at age 14, the student should be invited. So we talked about this as well, whose presence is required versus who are not required versus whose presence could be excused. I am not going to go over this anymore. And we talked about this. What is the general curriculum? We talked about how the general curriculum, the academics that are taught, are made up of the Massachusetts curriculum frameworks, which are the Common Core, the local district curriculum frameworks, and MCAS or MCAS Alt. I should also add in there, it might be PARC. But as you probably know, PARC has not been formally adopted by Massachusetts. Therefore, every school district in Massachusetts was given the option of doing MCAS or PARC. In addition, students who are in 10th grade and need to pass MCAS, they must pass MCAS, not PARC. So why is a good IEP important? A good IEP is important because the IEP is all about access to that general education as well as, or to the general curriculum, I should say, as well as to the life of the school. And it's about accountability, making sure that the school is doing what they said they were doing. In addition, the school being accountable to the state for maintaining high academic standards and things like that. So let's just dive in real quickly. So the IEP document, as you probably know, is a very confusing, a very complex, and a very comprehensive document. So the way I like to think of an IEP is I like to think of the various components and then kind of think about how they're integrated. So I've listed here in order the various components. So we start with the parent and student concerns. We then go to the student strengths and key evaluation results, the vision statement, something called PLEP A and PLEP B. PLEP stands for Present Levels of Educational Performance. It will always be referred to as PLEP, either A or B. And we're going to talk about what's the difference between A and B. The current performance levels and the measurable annual goals. That's where we're writing out the goals. And then there is that ever so confusing service delivery grid. There's also the non-participation justification, the schedule modification, the transportation services, the state or district-wide assessments, additional information, the parent response, and then the educational placement. So This is IEP 1 on your writing guide. So if you have your writing guide in front of you and the first page of your writing guide is a flow chart about eligibility, turn it over to the next page. It'll down in the bottom right-hand corner say IEP 1. This is that first page of the IEP document. Here we have the section for the parent and student concerns. Then we have the section for the student strengths and evaluations. And then we have the section for the vision statement. I just wanted to orient you to the IEP by including this slide. So we start off with concerns, okay? What concerns do I have? What concerns does the student have? Maybe there are concerns that both of you have. What should we be looking at for this year? Which skills should be stronger? The parent concerns are the parents' concerns, okay, not the school's concerns. And your concerns they may vary from year to year, and the purpose of having concerns is to document what it is that you feel the student should be doing, what you're worried about in terms of the student not doing, and things like that. You can include your parent concerns verbatim. You could submit them ahead of time. What I do encourage you to do is if your student is of age to be able to articulate his or her concerns, that you make sure that those are included. This will kind of set the tone for the IEP meeting. The concerns and the vision together are kind of going to help drive the identification of the goals that ultimately are developed. So the next section is your student's strengths. Okay, this is really, really, really important because this is a section of the IEP where we can let the student shine. We talk about what the student actually does well. If you think about IEP meetings and you think about this IEP document, it's all about what the student doesn't do. Well, guess what? This is the section where we can talk about what the student can do. And this is really important because part of the goal of an IEP is to capitalize on a student's strengths. So, what do they do well at home? What do they do well at school and in the community? Are they involved in organizations? Are they really good at horseback riding? Are they really good at baseball? Are they really good at taking care of kids? What do they like to do? Do they like sports? Do they like television shows? Do they like, movies? Do they like going out with their friends? Do they like to read? Are they very artistic? The sky's the limit that you can put here. What you really want to be doing is describing their positive qualities and their successes, okay? This is also where we're going to be putting the evaluation data. What do the evaluations tell us? It's going to describe the student's disability, okay? There's a label, and then there's describing what is actually going on. And I talked about this in the first part. When you have a student who has ADHD or a student who has autism, it's one thing to say that the student has autism or the student has ADHD. What you really want to be concerned with is how is the student's ability to function, how are their skills affected by this diagnosis? Excuse me, what's really important is that evaluation, must include written recommendations. Okay? This is according to the law, and it's absolutely imperative that these recommendations be put into the evaluation reports. And remember, we talked about getting those reports 2 days before the meeting. What is not acceptable is a report saying recommendations will be discussed at the meeting. That is not what the law says. That is clearly in violation of the law, and that's something that program quality assurance can help you out with. Okay? But this harkens back to the importance of evaluations. This is the information that the team is going to be relying on. Okay? In addition to looking at what the student does well, what they like to do, that sort of thing, and looking at obviously the evaluation results, we want to also consider things like how did they do on MCAS last year? What were their strengths? What were their weaknesses? Did they pass? Did they not pass? Did they pass with accommodations? Did they do the MCAS portfolio? Was it a very difficult and stressful time for them? Were the goals from last year's IEP met? Revisit those goals. The one thing you do not want to have in an IEP is the same goal being carried over from year to year to year. Goals are designed to be achieved within 1 year's time. If they have not been met in 1 year's time, then something is wrong and they need to be revisited. What can your child do developmentally and functionally in both academic and non-academic settings? So, for instance, we could, thinking in terms of the academic setting, that's pretty straightforward. We can talk about what they're doing, both in reading and writing and math, and maybe they're struggling in history, or they love science, or whatever it is. But how are they interacting with their peers? Are they developing friendships, appropriate friendships? Are they having behavior problems? Are they not able to stay in the classroom? Are they able to follow directions? Do they like school? Do they seem to enjoy it? Are they integrating well with other kids? Are they able to follow directions? All those sorts of things. These are the sorts of things we want to be talking about. Okay? This next section is vision, and vision is so important. You're going to keep hearing about vision throughout the entire course as well, because vision is important not only when it comes to the IEP, but also when it comes to transition planning. It's the vision for the student's future. Now, obviously, for younger students, it's going to be, I should also say this is the team's vision. So the team consists of the student and the parent and the school. And sometimes the parent can have a slightly different vision than the school has for a student than what the student has for themselves, okay? But what's really important is to be thinking in terms of where do we want to see this child going? And the whole reason we have this is, again, as I said in Basic Rights, the policy behind special education is to develop productive members of society who are able to fully participate, live as independently as possible, be as economically self-sufficient as possible, and just be very, happy citizens, if you will. And vision is what helps us get to that point. So don't be afraid to dream. A vision does not necessarily have to be realistic, although what I would argue is that as a student is getting older and you're approaching either graduation or you're approaching age 22, because special education services end on a student's 22nd birthday, I should say a student's eligibility for special education services. A student still needs to be found eligible using those 3 questions. But as a student's getting older, you want that vision to be somewhat realistic, because the whole idea behind the transition planning process is to prepare students to be launched into the adult world. And so we want them to be as prepared as possible. It is a journey of self-discovery for both the parents and the student, depending upon where you are in this disability journey. If it's a new diagnosis, a vision may look very different than if it's a student who was diagnosed when they were 3 and the student is now 12. It's important to listen to the student. I cannot stress that enough, that this is your student's. This is the child's education. The child is the one who has to sit there in class every single day. They're the ones who have to do the work. It's not the parents. And so it's really important to consider the student's voice. Certainly always be considering opportunities to try. I'm a big proponent of, you can try anything once, and it may not work. And obviously believe the best in your child by having high expectations. And I'll give you a very interesting example of that. With my daughter, when she was in grammar school, she was evaluated, and it was recommended that she be placed in a self-contained classroom. The outside evaluator felt very, very strongly that that was really what would be in her best interest. Interestingly enough, my school district felt just the opposite. They really believed that inclusion for my daughter would be great. They believed by giving her a one-on-one paraprofessional that she would be able to fully participate in the entire life of the school. And I really resisted that, because I had outside evaluators telling me actually essentially the opposite. Well, guess what? Guess who was right? The school district. They had much higher expectations in my daughter than I did, and I credit their expectations, their high expectations of her way back when she was in grammar school with the successes that she's experiencing now as a 20-year-old. So think, 1 to 5 years ahead when you're thinking about vision. Think about transitions from grade to grade, from one school to another, from as a student's getting older, what kinds of things do they want to be doing? Do they want to be having a job? Do they want to be getting a driver's license? Things like that. And especially when it comes to transition, you want to be thinking about what do they want to do when they graduate? What do they want to do in terms of post-secondary education? Do they want to go to college? Where do they want to work? Where do they want to live? That sort of thing. So I am now on IEP 2 and IEP 3. That's essentially the next page in your writing guide. IEP 2 is on the first page. IEP 3 is on the second page. This is where we're talking about those PLEPs, that present level of educational performance. And here's the difference, okay? PLEP A is all about access in the general curriculum. Okay. PLEP B is all about how their disability is affecting them in other educational areas. And if you look here, we have adaptive physical education, Braille needs, extracurricular activities, social and emotional needs, assistive technology devices, communication, language needs, travel training, behavior, communication, skill development. Okay. And then obviously here are some age-specific considerations. What these two pages are doing is these pages want to describe how a student's disability is affecting their progress or their ability to participate in these various areas. This is essentially the negative part of the IEP because it's talking about what the student cannot do. Okay? So here's the descriptive section where they're going to be in narrative form talking about how the disability is affecting progress in these areas and likewise the same here. Okay? But this is also the page where we're going to be finding accommodations. And we're going to be finding out what that specialized instruction is going to be looking like. So this is why PLEP A and PLEP B are really, really important for you to scrutinize and take a look at, because this is where you're going to find the accommodations and this is where you're going to find the specialized instruction. Okay? We talked about what modifying the content and the methodology and the performance criteria are all about, and we'll talk about those a little bit more as we go along. But remember, PLEP A is in the general curriculum. Those are the academics. PLEP B is everything else. Okay? So it's all about identifying in PLEP A and PLEP B. Once we're identifying not only how the disability is affecting progress, but we also want to identify what can we do to help the student succeed. Okay? PLEP A and PLEP B are going to help drive the identification of the skills and skill areas that need work. And that in turn will help develop what goals we want to be working on. Okay, so we talked all about this, what these various things mean. And here's just another way to just compare the two. Again, PLEP A is about the general curriculum. It's about the curriculum frameworks. PLEP B is everything else. I will mention that PLEP B comes into play when we're talking about transition, because transition planning is really all about all of those other needs. What things does a student need to know in order to function in society? If you recall, we saw travel training as an option, and that is huge. We all need to be able to get around. We need to be able to navigate our communities, and we need to be able to get from point A to point B. For some students, that means driving. For other students, that means taking public transportation. But that can also mean being able to walk safely down the street, being able to walk safely on the sidewalk. So for instance, with all the snow that we have narrow streets and we have very, very tall snowbanks on either side of the street. So my daughter is not the best when it comes to walking on streets, particularly streets that do not have sidewalks. And just yesterday, she wanted to take the late bus home from school. And of course, the late bus never drops you off at your house. So I had to call the school and I had to explain to them that I don't think that my daughter has the skills to be able to be safe on the street and navigate the street, navigate cars in the street, and be able to know what to do if a car is coming towards her. So you better believe that that is something that we're going to be working on in our IEP, and that travel training would appear on PLEP B. Okay, and again, this is just another way to put what we're talking about. PLEP A and PLEP B talk about skill weakness, how the weakness impacts success, and addressing each component of the disability. And here, this is just to kind of get you thinking on PLEP B. We want to be talking about sometimes things like organization, attention, anxiety, and organization. Just, how do you organize your prioritize your workload? How do you keep track of all of your homework? But it also can apply to things like writing. How do you write a paragraph? You're assigned a 3-paragraph paper, or you're assigned a book report. How do you start? What do you do? Attention. This is obviously for kids who have ADHD, who are having real trouble processing information and being able to stay focused and things like that. What can we do? Breaks or whatever. So let's quickly talk about an accommodation, because as I said, accommodations are on that PLEP A and that PLEP B. An accommodation just changes, it changes within the learning environment. It allows access to the same information. It levels the playing field. It does not change the game. Okay? An accommodation is not the same as specialized instruction. So there are lots and lots and lots of different types of accommodations out there. And here are just a few of them. Excuse me, extended testing time, preferred seating, digital books and aid, reading and writing software, maybe it's pre-teaching information to a student, maybe it's a second set of books at home. Maybe it is it's Braille books. Maybe it's like I said, a special software. I mean, it can be so many different types of things. The thing about accommodations is that you need to be very specific about what the accommodation is. Oh, a sensory break is another one. That's actually a very, very good one. Sometimes kids need to have water. Maybe there's a rule about not having water in the classroom. Maybe they need some sort of like a little squishy ball for those who are having a hard time concentrating. Maybe the little squishy bowl. Preferred seating, whether it be sitting away from a window, maybe closer to the teacher, maybe sitting in a small group or whatever. I mean, it really, the sky's the limit. But again, we talked about how important evaluations are and how evaluations drive the entire process. Evaluations are going to drive the identification of accommodations. Okay, so now we're talking about specialized instruction. Okay, and it's a special education teacher, a special educator, who is responsible for modifying the curriculum, okay, and designing specialized instruction. And we talked about this in the last webinar, that content means changing what is actually being taught. Maybe you're being taught just key concepts. Maybe you're being taught out of certain chapters. Maybe just I don't know, the first 3 pages or whatever. The sky's the limit. The key being that you want enough being taught so that the access to the content is meaningful. Okay, and the student is able to derive a benefit. So the methodology, delivery of instruction. What's key to remember here, as well as all actually content and methodology, is that this is unique to one particular student. So even if a student is in a specialized classroom where everybody is getting ABA therapy, let's just say, well, maybe that's not necessarily the most appropriate intervention for or methodology for your student. Maybe your student needs something different. Maybe that wasn't the best example. The use of manipulatives. Maybe manipulative for math work for one student but not another. And so it's important that this be individualized for one particular student. Performance criteria. The example that I like to use is a couple years ago when my daughter was in school. She does struggle with, like a lot of students, but she really does struggle with regular written exams. They're very difficult for her for a lot of reasons. And one day the class was playing Jeopardy, and they realized that that was a very effective way for my daughter to demonstrate facts. So especially history facts or science facts. And so that was one of the performance criteria that we used, was that sometimes she would play Jeopardy, and that's how she would demonstrate what she was learning. Okay? Specialized instruction is specialized and specially designed for one particular student based upon that particular student's needs. And the specialized instruction needs to be identified and described in PLEP A for the academics and PLEP B for everything else. Okay? So this slide is in here just to sort of to help introduce to you where supplementary aids and services come into play. Okay, excuse me. They do appear on PLEP A and PLEP B quite often, not always. You know, we have the one-on-one support. Maybe you can have some OT support or PT support or something like that. But really, the supplementary aids and services are going to be maybe identified on PLEP A or PLEP B, but they're going to be described in the service delivery grid, and they're going to be described somewhat in the goals. And I'll explain what I mean by that in just a moment. But supplementary aids and services, they are designed to enable a child to be educated to the maximum extent appropriate in the general classroom, or if they can't, wherever it is that they are able to learn. It's to help facilitate a learning, to help facilitate access, and to help facilitate a meaningful benefit. And like I said, it does occur in all settings. So regular education, other education-related settings, you know, that could be, you know, music, art, gym, but that could be recess, that could be field trips, and then obviously extracurricular and non-academic settings. That could be prom. So I know for many students, they do need a one-on-one chaperone going to certain events. And so in order for them to be able to go to the prom, they may need to have a one-on-one person there just with them. And that needs to be provided. So we are now on IEP 4, okay? This is the page that talks about goals. Remember what we said about goals. Goals are all about developing skills. The IEP document is all about helping, it's first of all about identifying skill deficits, skills that a student needs to work on. And then it's about identifying which goal or goals will have the biggest benefit for the student and help the student with their learning. Okay? And just by looking at the anatomy of how a goal is written on this form, and I should mention that this form that we're using is a form that was approved by the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. It is a DESE approved form, and it must be used by all school districts. So all IEPs here in Massachusetts need to look like this. Okay? The font might be a little bit different, but they need to be using this form. They need to be set up this way. So there needs to be a PLEP A, a PLEP B, and so forth and so on. So this can get very confusing, because if you look at this page, and you can follow along on your IEP 4 in the writing guide, the first thing you can see here is there's a number for the goal. This is really, really important, okay? They do need to number each goal, because the goal is going to appear again on the service delivery grid, and you need to be able to go back and identify it. So there needs to be a numerical number. So it's usually 1, 2, 3, 4, so forth and so on. And then the specific goal focus, or the goal area. Now, you can have more than one goal in a particular goal area. You can have 2 social and emotional goals. You can have you know, 2 math goals or 2 ELA goals. I mean, there is nothing in the law that says you can only have a certain number of goals, or you must have at least a certain number of goals, or you can't have goals in this area. There is so much latitude given to school districts under the system that we have in place, which is good, because the law doesn't want to confine people to certain predetermined goal areas or goals or whatever. So if we look at this form, the first little subsection here is the current performance level. Okay, this is where As opposed to PLEP A, where we were talking about how the disability is affecting performance, here we want to talk about, within this goal area, what can the student currently do today? Today meaning the day that we're writing this goal, okay? And then down here is where we're going to be writing what the goal looks like. Okay, what is the goal? What is the goal that we want the student to achieve by the end of this IEP term? And then down here we have objectives or benchmarks, which essentially just take that overarching goal and break it down into smaller steps, depending upon whether it's sort of sequential steps or it's timelines. And we're going to look a little bit more in detail as to what that looks like. But understand that this current performance level is talking about what a student can do right now, versus PLEP talking about what a student can't do. And that's an important distinction. Okay, so here's this lovely slide here that kind of gives you a sense of all of the different kinds of options that exist. And again, this is not an exhaustive list whatsoever. Interestingly enough, I put here in the center self-advocacy. When we get to, especially for students who are of transition age, so that would be 14 years or older, we need to be teaching these students how to advocate on behalf of themselves, because they're not always going to have mom and dad there. They're not always going to have a teacher there. And especially for students who want to be going, after they graduate, they want to be going on to a job or going on to college. Mom and dad are not going to be there. They need to be able to advocate for themselves. They need to be able to identify and ask for whatever supports and services they think they need, whatever accommodations they need due to their disability. So self-advocacy is really, really important. And here at the Federation, we are real proponents of promoting self-advocacy as early as possible. So you don't necessarily have to have a goal that's entitled self-advocacy. Quite often, self-advocacy goals are embedded within other types of goals. But let's just take a look at some of these for a moment. So there are sort of let's start here, general curriculum. So I had said earlier, you never want to take the curriculum frameworks and dump them into the IEP. That doesn't make sense, and that is true. We have curriculum areas such as reading, writing, and mathematics because they are skills. Reading and writing are the fundamental skills that we need for reading, for learning, for reading our textbooks and writing our papers and writing research papers and things like that. And obviously for reading the newspaper and keeping up on current events, for being able to write a letter or communicate with somebody else. And then mathematics obviously comes into play in so many different ways in our life. You know, in terms of academics, you need your math skills for any of your sciences, obviously to go on in mathematics, but we need it for money management, we need it for time management, we need it for, you know, when we're measuring things, when we're following a recipe, when we're trying to figure out if the curtains that we just bought are going to be fitting our windows. I mean, these are all skills. Likewise, general skills, you know, memory, communication, social and emotional, behavioral, organization, time management, vocational skills. So vocational skills more come into play when you have students who are on that vocational track. What kind of skills do they need in order to be employed, to be employable? And what kind of skills do they need to be employable in an area that they enjoy? So for instance, my daughter's in a life skills program. There is heavy, heavy, heavy emphasis on vocational skills. But not only in the areas of interest, so working in a hospital or working at the YMCA or working with kids, it's what kinds of skills do they need? They need to be looking at being able to follow directions, being able to give directions to people, being able to greet, being able to do things that they don't necessarily always enjoy. The services goals down here. When I was talking about supplementary aids and services and supports, if there is an occupational therapist working with a student directly, there needs to be an accompanying goal that they're working towards. Same thing with physical therapy, speech, and even counseling. Okay, life skills. They cannot be the only goal. I must add that the law is very clear that for students in IEPs, Life skills goals may be appropriate, but if they are, it cannot be the only goal that you're working towards, okay? Life at the school, and I think I mentioned this in basic rights, life at the school is not defined anywhere in the law, but it is contemplated throughout the law. It's all about being a part of the school community. Okay, so in order to be in school sports or clubs or social events or assemblies or, or whatever, depending upon the student's interests and needs, there may be some skills that they need to learn in order to participate. So I keep coming back to being able to take turns or being able to listen to differences of opinion, or being able to maybe not always have your idea followed. So if the group wants to go to Buffalo Wild Wings and you want to go to the Olive Garden, well, learning that sometimes you're not going to be able to go to the Olive Garden because the majority wants to go to Buffalo Wild Wings. So, it's things like that. And then transition goals. You're going to hear all about these when you hear the presentation on transition. So I'm not going to go into more detail. But this is just to give you a nice overview of how to start thinking about identifying skills for a particular student. And again, you as the parent aren't responsible for coming up with this. You as the advocate, likewise. It is a team decision. So if you get to the table and you really feel very strongly that perhaps there needs to be a time management goal and it's not addressed, at that point you can say, listen, I think that there's some skills that go along with time management that we really need to be working on. So we talked about this, okay? The current performance level, or the CPL, is it appears, first of all, in the Measurable Annual Goals section, so on IEP 4, and it's specific, it's limited to that goal area, and it's all about what the student can do today. And again, it's used for skill building and writing the goal, whereas PLEP, which was IEP 2 and 3, it's more focused on how is the disability affecting the student in general. Okay, so a nice little slogan here: a goal that is not measurable is just a slogan. So when we are talking about trying to draft a goal, it can seem like a very, very, very daunting task, and I agree, it is. It is. Desi came up with this really nice way of diagramming goals, kind of the way that we used to diagram sentences when we were back in English language arts, okay? And I'm going to get into that in a second. But as you're thinking about developing the goals and developing the objectives and the benchmarks, the team should really be thinking about at the same time, how are we going to know that the student is working towards this goal? How are we going to know when a student has achieved a particular milestone within the goal or the goal? How often are we collecting data? Who's going to collect the data? That sort of thing. IDEA requires that this be considered. So again, just talking about goals and helping to provide you with a framework with which to think about goals. We said that the current performance level is all about what the student can do now, that the goal needs to be a measurable skill or behavior. And again, you want to pick a skill or behavior that's going to have the greatest impact. You're not going to be able to work on everything. It's impossible. You just can't. And so it's all about prioritizing. And sometimes trying to come up with that priority is part of the team discussion. And then that goal is going to be broken down into either objectives, which are just smaller steps that are short-term and measurable, or benchmarks, which they're essentially milestones. So think of objectives as a recipe. First, we want to make a cake, so first of all, what we're going to do is we're going to get the dry ingredients, and then we're going to get the eggs and the wet ingredients, and then we're going to mix it together. And then we're going to, oops, see, I'm out of order, we're going to flour the pan, and then we're going to pour the batter into the pan, and then we're going to put it into the oven. Those are smaller steps. They're short-term measurable, whereas a milestone is more associated with a time period. So by the first marking period, you might do this. By the second marking period, you might do this. We're going to see some examples in a moment. So Desi, to kind of help facilitate understanding a goal and helping you determine whether or not the goal is a measurable goal and is really a good goal, they've come up with this way of diagramming it. So what they do is they think of a goal in terms of having a target behavior, a condition, and a criteria. And the target behavior is obviously the skill or behavior that we want to change. The condition is the circumstances under which the target behavior is going to occur. And then the criteria is just the level of performance, okay? How often or how will we know that the student has achieved this? Okay, and this will make more sense in the next slide, okay? So here is an example of Nadia. And Nadia is going to be working on a writing goal, okay? And so here is the annual goal. Here is the measurable annual goal. And it says here that Nadia will write a 6-sentence paragraph using 4 types of sentences, scoring 45 out of 50 on the district writing rubric. Okay? That's a pretty lofty goal. And the point is that she has 1 year to complete this goal. But it really makes sense when you're trying to help Nadia achieve this to break it down into smaller steps. And that's exactly what happened below here. Okay? So here are the objectives. First, given a list of sentences, Nadia is going to accurately label the 4 types of sentences. That's the first thing she needs to be able to do, because up here, part of the goal is she's going to be using these 4 types of sentences. Well, if she doesn't know what they are, she's never going to get there. So first, we're going to teach her what the 4 types of sentences are. Then, we're going to teach her to be able to write acceptable examples of those 4 types of sentences when asked. Because ultimately, she's going to be asked to write a 6-sentence paragraph using these. So from there, we're going to now have it on a paragraph. So given a sample paragraph, she'll be able to consistently and correctly label the components of the paragraph. She needs to understand what a paragraph is, because not only is she being asked to use the 4 types of sentences, she's also being asked to write a 6-sentence paragraph. So, and then lastly, given a topic, Nadia will be able to write a paragraph using 3 out of the 4 types of sentences. So you can see how each step builds upon the previous step. And then here, we're going to know that she's achieved that goal when she has scored 45 out of 50 on the district writing rubric. So that's one example. So let's come over here, and this is a transportation goal. So in this one, we're talking about Jillian. And Monday through Friday, Jillian will use the public transportation system to get to and from her job placement independently. And she will arrive at work on time for any 5 consecutive days. Okay. So for most of us, that's not a problem, although I have to say today, given the snowstorm and all the delays on our transit system, this may be kind of impossible. But that being said, so let's take a look at the benchmarks, because here, these are more time sensitive. So by the end of the first quarter, what she's going to be working on is accompanied by an adult. She's going to walk to the bus stop. She's going to ride the bus to work. And she's going to get off at the correct work bus stop. So as you can see, we've broken down this goal into a smaller step or steps. And we've also identified by what time she's going to achieve that. Okay, so we're hoping that by the end of the first quarter, she will have been able to achieve this. So then building upon this skill, by the end of the second quarter, she will then be able to identify the steps she'll need to follow to independently travel to work. Okay? And so she's obviously going to have to identify what those steps are, and she may need some assistance doing that. So then, by the end of the third quarter, we're hoping that Jillian will independently walk to the bus stop, ride the bus to work, and get off at the correct bus stop. So, how do we know when she's able to do this? We're going to know that she's achieved this goal when she's able to do it independently and arriving at work on time for 5 consecutive days. So just think about that. We're going to talk about data collection in just a second, but this is how we're going to know that she's achieved the goal. And so the point of this being a measurable goal is an important one. You have to be able to look at the goal and identify, and be able to identify how we will know when a student has achieved that particular goal. So here is, I think, one more example. I think this is the last example. So this is a communication goal, okay? And in this goal, Scarlett will independently answer yes and no questions by looking up for yes and looking down for no to express two complex choices. That should be choices, not choice. Okay. So what's the target behavior? The target behavior is she's going to look up for yes and look down for no. And the condition is she's going to be doing it independently by answering yes and no questions. Okay? And how are we going to know? Because she's going to be expressing two complex choices. So, again, looking at this example, by the first progress report, she will be able to answer with a reliable yes by looking up 3 to 5 times daily. Okay? She needs to be able to communicate what yes is and obviously be able to communicate no. So clearly for her, these yes and no questions, communicating yes and no, are very difficult for her. So by the second progress report, we're going to have her just be focusing on answering no. Okay? And then by the third, we're going to hope that she's able to answer yes or no to express one simple choice, thereby building us up to ultimately having her express two complex choices. Okay? So those are 3 examples of measurable goals. Now, one of the things you do see quite often is you see things like 80% accuracy, 4 out of 5 times daily, things like that. You see the 4 out of 5 times daily here. You know, different people have different opinions about that. And my feeling is the following. Everybody has to know, it needs to be crystal clear, what is 80% or what is 4 out of 5 times. Okay, what does that look like? So here, 4 out of 5 times daily, I think is pretty, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's pretty clear. 80% accuracy. Well, it kind of depends on what type of accuracy we're talking about. And you know, it's really hard to say, does it make sense here? Does it not make sense here? I think what you really need to do is you need to take a look at the goal, look at the skill that you're working on, and make sure that it is very, very clear that you know what 80% is, if that is going to be what your criteria is going to be. I think it works sometimes for certain types of goals, and it doesn't work for other types of goals. But the other thing with the criteria is that you want to be sure that your data collection strategies support that. So when we're thinking about data collection, it's really important to keep in mind who is collecting the data, when is the data being collected, and how. And one thing that parents don't realize is they can ask for this data, because this data is what is being used to prepare the progress reports. And so if you have some questions or you're questioning something on a progress report, you do have a right to ask for the data that's supporting that. So under the who, you know, think about it. Who is going to be doing this? Is it the general education teacher, the special education teacher, the related service provider, a paraprofessional? Is it the student who is self-assessing? You know, how often? Is it daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly? And, you know, how are they doing it? There are lots of different ways. It's observations, it's checklists, it's portfolios, it's tests, it's rubrics, it's lots of different things, okay? But when you're drafting the goal and you're trying to assess whether or not it's measurable, think in terms of what are the data collection strategies that are going to be used when we're monitoring whether or not a student is achieving that. And that will hopefully bring into focus the measurability of the goal. Another thing that I do tell people to keep in mind is level of independence, particularly if that is an issue for a student. So, you know, quite often you have students who need prompts or they need reminders to do certain things, and a perfect example would be when you're dealing with an organizational goal or a time management goal. Clearly you have that there because the student is not able to organize themselves, organize their work, organize their day, or they're not able to prioritize, they don't know where to start. Or maybe you see it also with writing when a student isn't quite sure how to sit down and write that 2-page or that 3-paragraph book report. They don't know where to start. And so if independence is an issue or prompting is an issue, you want to make sure that that's addressed in the goal. Is it with one prompt? Is it with fading prompts? Ultimately, is the goal with no prompts? Is it completely independent? You know, what is it? Things that you want to take into consideration. And so that happens to be one thing that I'm always looking at with goals, in addition to making sure that we're assessing that they are measurable. And number two, that the goal is, you know, asking yourself, what kind of impact is this skill going to have on the student's ability to learn and their ability to access the curriculum? So again, this is just the data collection strategies. We're not going to really go into it. So here is the next section. This is IEP 5. And this, I think, is the most confusing part of the entire IEP. It is interesting to say the least. This grid will show you all of the services that a student will be receiving, including specialized instruction, throughout either the week or the cycle. So the way you start reading this is you do this. You start off by taking a look at the school district cycle. It's in this tiny, tiny, tiny little font here. For some school districts, it's a 5-day cycle, Monday through Friday. That's the easiest. For some districts or some schools, it is a 6-day cycle. So you have, I know when I was in high school, we had A day, B day, C day, E day, and F day. A, B, C, D, E, F. Yes, F day. And then it started all over again. So it was a cycle. So every week was different. 10-day cycles get really, really confusing. It is essential that you make sure that this is filled out. Okay? So the service delivery grid is broken down into 3 different sections. There's the top section here in green called indirect services. This is consultation only. This is between provider to provider or provider to parent. It does not include any services directly to the student. Okay, so it may be that the speech and language pathologist is going to be consulting with the special education teacher once a week for 15 minutes. Or maybe the school psychologist is going to be consulting with the behavioral specialist. Or it may be that the classroom teacher is going to be consulting with the parent once a week. Okay, the way this grid is filled out, and it's the same with direct services and pullout, is on here on the left you have what goal they're going to be focusing on. For every single service that's listed, there must be a goal or goal area that is mentioned here, and it's referenced by number. So remember when I was talking about the page with the goals, which was what, IEP 4, and I said you start off with a number for that goal. That's the identifier, if you will, the numerical identifier for that goal, and that needs to be noted over here. Okay? And then next we have the type of service. Okay? What type of a service is it? It might be consultation. It might be mentoring. Down here it will probably be OT services or PT services or special education services or whatever. Same thing with down here. The type of personnel. Who is going to be delivering that service? Is it the classroom teacher? Is it the specialist? Whoever it is, it needs to be listed. And then over here, the frequency and duration per cycle. This is where it gets so confusing, especially when you're not dealing with a 5-day cycle. Let's see. It could be perhaps up here in indirect services, it could be that we're working on goal number 2, that it is counseling it's counseling consultation, and so it is the the school psychologist meeting, talking with the special education teacher, and it may be 1 times 15 per cycle. Okay, you need to put the start date and the end date. And quite often the start date is the first day of the IEP cycle, and the end date is when the last day of the IEP cycle. Okay, so as you can see, this is very, very confusing. So the top section is indirect services. Down here, The purple section, direct services, and this sort of pinky red, the pull-out services or services outside of the classroom. Those are all services that are being provided directly to the student. So it's still the same. You need to have a goal area, a goal number, what type of service it is, who is doing it, the frequency, start and end date. Now, direct services refer to services that are being provided in the general education classroom. That's the regular classroom with typical peers, okay? Anything that's not occurring there, you can also think of it as what we call push-in services, occurs here, okay? So anything that's pulled out, any special classroom services, any summer services, special school, if you're in a therapeutic school, an outside district placement or whatever, all of that is going to be listed here. So when you're looking at the service delivery grid, there are a couple things that you want to do. First of all, you want to be taking a look at what goals are being worked on. And you want to make sure that every goal that's accounted for in the IEP is accounted for here on the service delivery grid, that they're working towards it. And you would be surprised how often they forget to put something on. Second of all, you want to add up the amount of time that each person is spending and making sure it makes sense. What you don't want to run into is a situation where there are more minutes per day being accounted for in here than there are in the regular school day. And that happens. Okay? And you also want to pay attention to the start date and the end date, particularly when it comes to summer services. Okay? So the service delivery grid is very confusing. I won't lie. I think it takes a while to learn how to read those. And the best thing to do is really scrutinize this by looking at the goals and making sure that it is consistent with what was discussed. Now, remember in basic rights I told you about that rule, that 45-day rule, that if at the conclusion of the IEP meeting that the parent receives a copy of the completed summary service delivery grid as well as a summary of the goal areas, then the school district has 2 additional weeks to get the IEP to the parent. This is the service delivery grid. This is what I'm talking about. Okay, so do ask for this, even the rough version of it. Ask them to provide you with a copy of it. Okay, and so this slide just summarizes what we just talked about. Okay, when you're talking about the goal, you want to be thinking about who will be working with the student, how often and where is that going to be occurring, and again, the top part is or they call it Grid A, is indirect services. It's consultation only. Grid B is direct services. That's in the classroom, the regular classroom. Part C is everything else. Okay? So why is the service delivery form important? Well, it's important for a lot of things because it tells you what the school is committing to do. Okay, the service environment, the goal focus, what type of a service, who's doing it, the service schedule, and the service duration. If it is not on the service delivery grid, it's not going to happen. So if the school district says that your student's going to get OT twice a week, but we don't need to put it on the IEP, you better believe they do. Because if it's not on the service delivery grid, it doesn't have to happen. Okay, and when we were talking about accountability at the very beginning, part of the reason we have this IEP document is to keep the school district accountable for providing the supports and services that they agreed to do. So this next section is on IEP 6. Okay, and there are 3 sections here. The first one is removal from the general education classroom. So this section is required because we want to know, we want to justify why a student is being removed from the general education classroom. Remember we talked about least restrictive environment, LRE. The presumption is that a student's going to be in the general education classroom. If they're going to be pulled out, it has to be justified. And so if yes is checked off here, there needs to be a description as to why. This next section is really important, and it's amazing how it's just so teeny tiny. This is the schedule modification. This is where a shorter or a longer day is going to be indicated. This is also where you're going to see summer services, especially longer year, right here. Okay? Now, a little bit about summer services that I'll say is this. The purpose of summer services is to prevent regression. Okay, it is not to teach new material, and that is really, really important for parents to understand. I think sometimes parents think that we need to be continuing summer services because they need to be, keep working on skills. In reality, it's to prevent regression. So that being said, you always want to take a look at this. And then here is transportation services, and I mentioned that transportation can be very thorny sometimes. This is where, if this is checked off, it means that transportation is going to be it's going to be considered a related service, and whatever the school district has committed themselves to doing here, they must do. This is when regular transportation is sufficient for getting the student to school. We can talk more about transportation if you have specific questions, because it is a whole can of worms that I'm not going to get into right now. But just understand there is a whole section devoted exclusively to transportation services. So here is now IEP 7. And this is the section that talks about the participation in MCAS or PARC. Now remember, every student must participate in either MCAS or PARC. And as I mentioned at the beginning, if you have a student in 10th grade, that student must be taking MCAS, at least at this point until or if Massachusetts accepts PARC. So you want to indicate which type of MCAS they're going to be taking. And here, if they're going to be taking the regular exam, here is where you want to be listing the accommodations. There are both standard and non-standard accommodations. Non-standard accommodations, you do need to get permission from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education for. For example, the use of a calculator is a non-standard accommodation. Okay. Any accommodation that a student needs on MCAS, first, must be listed here. Second, it must be an accommodation that they typically use in the classroom. Okay. And in order for a student to be able to avail themselves of any of these accommodations, this must be accepted on the IEP. So when you're talking about your exception or your accepting or the rejecting of an IEP, and you're considering rejecting an IEP in its entirety, if a student is going to be taking MCAS and they need accommodations, you probably want to accept these. Even if you disagree with certain accommodations and you feel there should be more, you can certainly reject the omission of certain accommodations, but at least accept what you currently have so the student can use those when they take MCAS. MCAS Alt is used for just a small percentage of students. It's a portfolio-based assessment, and what they do is they submit samples of a student's work. It is a team decision as to whether or not a student will take MCAS Alt. Don't just assume because a student is in a particular type of a classroom that student is going to be taking the MCAS Alt. My daughter did MCAS Alt for, I think, 3 years, and she actually did do regular MCAS in high school, and she did have both standard and non-standard accommodations, and she actually did amazingly pass both. So this just goes a little bit into a little bit more detail about what we were just talking about, MCAS and MCAS PARC. I'm just going to go through it. This last part, placement. We talked about in basic rights how there's FAPE in the LRE. And we first determine what FAPE is, and then from there we determine what placement is going to be. Where is LRE? Where is it going to take place? Okay? It is determined by the needs of the child. Okay, and I can't tell you the magic formula that is used. It really depends on the needs of the child as identified and defined within the evaluations, and that is why the evaluations are so vital. So if you as a parent have an outside evaluator who's recommending an out-of-district placement, among the many things that you're going to need to do, you're going to need to make sure that evaluator is tying that recommendation of an outside placement to the identified needs of the child based upon the child's performance during the evaluation results. Don't tie it to a diagnosis. Don't say children with autism benefit from being in such and such a classroom or such and such a school. Okay? In addition, it is very helpful if that evaluator is familiar with both the current placement that the student is in and the proposed placement. And I can't stress enough how important that is. Placement is a very unique decision, unique to every single student, and obviously it is an issue of contention for many, and I can't tell you what the magic solution is. So this just says the IEP fits the student, the placement fits the IEP, and that's the thinking you need to have. So when you have a student who has been diagnosed with ADHD or a learning disability, and somebody says that student needs landmark, going from that diagnosis to landmark may involve many, many, many steps, including many trials and errors and failures before the student ultimately gets there, because special education is not proactive, it is reactive, unfortunately. So, that being said, how do you respond? Well, first of all, let's look at this last page, IEP 8. Okay, here at the top is additional information, and this is a great little section that you can put anything else you want in there. Okay, now one thing I need to remind you about is form over substance, is that we have this form with specific sections, and if for some reason something doesn't make it into one section, it doesn't mean it can't go in another section. And sometimes you'll find things here in additional information, and even though it's maybe not in the proper place elsewhere in the document, if it's here and it's very clearly stated, speech and language during summer twice a week for 30 minutes, and it's not on the service delivery grid, but it's here, it's got to happen. It's got to happen. So this is a handy section, sort of a catch-all. You can put a lot of different information there. So here is the response section. First of all, you have the school signature, and you will always have the school signature on the document before it's given to you for signature. And here is where the parent responds. The parent can either accept the IEP as developed, they can reject the IEP as developed, or they can reject the following portions of the IEP with the understanding that anything that they don't reject will be deemed accepted. And they can write it out here. If they need more room, they can write, please see attached letter, or please see attached description. Okay? You can also request a meeting to discuss the rejected IEP. Okay? And then there are certainly additional comments that you can make. This is really, really, really important. Okay? And it's important that the parent sign and date. So here's the placement page, and it's very, very confusing, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it, other than to say, take a look at what is checked off, what is being proposed for the student, and you're either going to consent to it, these are identical here, you're going to consent to it, you're going to refuse it, or request a meeting. Sign it and date it. Okay? And these pages are PL1 and PL1. I think they are in your writing guide, so you can take a look at them. Okay? I have put this in here just to introduce it to you. You are going to learn a lot more. It's not in your writing guide. You're going to learn a lot more about it when you see the transition, when you hear the transition presentation, but I put it here. I'm going to tell you this. The transition planning form is a 2-page form that's designed to be a worksheet. It is a worksheet to help guide the transition planning discussion. It is not a form that must be part of the IEP. It is required to be filled out and placed in the student's file, and it is used to help generate it can help generate transition goals on the IEP. It might help generate some accommodations and so forth that you're going to see on PLEP, typically PLEP B. So I just introduce it to you here. If you have a student who is age 14 or older on an IEP, you must be seeing this form at the IEP meeting, and if you don't, you need to ask about it. We talked about this in basic rights. Once the IEP has been accepted, all service providers must have access to that IEP, know their responsibilities under the IEP, and they must implement those accommodations, modifications, and supports. It does not say that they must have a copy of it, although it is a good idea. And so you as a parent may want to, at the beginning of the year, beginning of the semester, have a quick conversation with the teacher and inquire as to whether or not, A, they realize your child is on an IEP, and B, if they have it. And I would not hesitate to just bring a copy of the signed IEP yourself and provide it to the teacher. We've talked about how you can respond to an IEP. And we have talked about in basic rights all of your dispute resolution options. So I'm not going to talk about these. So these last couple of slides are slides that are just determined to remind you about why we have IEPs and why IEPs are so important, and we don't want to just fluff them off. They need to be written with high expectations for a student, and they need to be consistent with the team's vision for the student, and the team includes the student and the parent. And remember, it's skills oriented. So it's what skills will have the biggest impact for a particular student. Okay? Those goals and objectives must be measurable, and we must know how we're going to be collecting the data. How are we going to know that the student has achieved the goals that they've achieved? You also want to make sure that that service delivery grid is clear and that it is consistent with your understanding of what interventions and supports and services the student's going to be receiving. And clearly, IEPs are designed to increase a student's self-esteem, to help them with their self-advocacy, and help them to be better students and to be successful. So this last slide just shows you how it all fits together. It's a big, giant puzzle. It's a very integrated document. It's a confusing document. And I encourage you, if you have questions about the IEP development, to either email me questions or to write them down on the index cards so that I can answer them for everybody else. And here are just some resources. And so I want to thank you for listening to this second webinar, and I think now you should have a good, solid foundation with which to go forward in the class, and I look forward to meeting the rest of you, and I wish you all the best. Take care.